you should talk about your trip back.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the trip
'Cause
back
You were on a ship this time.
on what?
You were on a ship this time.
Yes, coming back was by ship. And we boarded in Calcutta. And the name of the ship was the T.S. Bliss. And we got some pictures of that vessel here. And, well,
I remember you telling a story about an explosion or something.
oh yeah. Well, we were on this vessel, and we went down the Bay of Bengal, kind of along the line of Burma. There, in fact, sometimes we could look over and we could see the Burma coastline. Well, one day we'd been out about 3 or 4 days, I guess, and I'd had lunch, and I was going down to my bunk to take a nap. And I was just getting ready to stretch out on my bunk, and there was a tremendous explosion.
Oh.
And it rocked the ship, and I didn't hear the motors going. And what I thought had happened was that one of the boilers in the ship had broken. And my thought was, oh, gosh, how long are we going to have to sit here before they can tow us back to Calcutta or send a rescue ship? I could see we might be delayed 6 months or so, all that. Well, some of the guys kind of panicked. They says, get on your seat, your life jackets. Well, thinking it was a boiler, I didn't feel any real danger. I was concerned about the delay. But I made sure I knew where my life jacket was and how to put it on. Well, what it turned out to be was, this is the scuttlebutt. You've never told anything officially, but the scuttlebutt was that they had detected a mine.
Oh, wow.
And we had a squad of Marines on board to kind of keep things going. And I was told, you know, I guess they stopped the engines on the boat, but I didn't notice it at that time because the boat was completely still. And I think they stopped it so he could take good aim at it. He shot it out with a rifle.
Oh, right.
And that big explosion was that thing going.
Wow.
It was a tremendous explosion.
Wow.
If we'd hit that,
Yeah.
we'd been in the drink.
Right.
But fortunately, after an hour or so, we were on our way again.
Well, that begs the question. Here's a boy that grew up in landlocked. Right. This begs the question. Here's a boy that grew up on land in Oregon, and you went to sea. Did you get your sea legs, or how was going to sea?
Oh
for
yeah,
you?
it was pretty good. Of course, the Bay of Bengal was pretty calm.
Oh, was it? Okay.
And it was kind of warm and sunny. We could go up on the bow and sunbathe or whatever we wanted to do like that. It was kind of nice until we got down. Then I was always interested kind of in Singapore. I was hoping we'd see Singapore. Well, we went through the straits there, but it was a night. All I could do was see the lights.
Oh, wow.
But then when we got out in the China Sea and the ocean, then we get this up and down. And a lot of guys were leaning over the rail. I was nauseated, but I just tried to control things, and I didn't have to do that. But then eventually you got used to it. And then, let's see, we started out from Calcutta down through there. I think the next stop was probably Manila.
Jeez.
And the only thing, we didn't get off. We were just down there for refueling. But the thing I remember most about that was all the sunken ships in the harbor. You know what? Near the masts are sticking out. But gee, there were just scads of them there. And then we went on to Guam. Still didn't get off the boat, just refueling, but I could look out and see Guam. And then I was hoping we'd go through Hawaii, but no, we went south of Hawaii and kind of, let's see, did we have another stop? I think maybe we stopped at Wake Island too. And I got a little story about Wake Island. When I was still home, and when things are looking kind of dangerous out that way, a friend of my folks went on a construction party to Wake Island to construct some barracks or whatever they were doing there. That's the last they ever heard from him.
Oh, wow. Wow.
But we went on, and then we met up with an aircraft carrier in the sea, and they were up there much higher than we were. We were yelling back and forth, just greeting each other. And I noticed the name of it was Hornet.
Oh, wow.
And so, we went on our own ways. As we got close to San Francisco, we got word, man overboard. And I thought there was kind of awnings there, and I remembered seeing kind of a shadow, and I'm sure that's he going overboard. Well, we stopped the vessel. They launched, put launches out and patrolled the whole area. We stayed there, I don't know, maybe a couple hours looking for him. Never did find him. But then the interesting thing about the Hornet was a few years ago, we have a place we used to go to on the coast, and we were out there, and we kind of took a tour through western Washington, and we went to Bremerton. And there we visited, they had it, at that time anyway, they had it all set up, the battleship on which he signed the things, the tear, so we sat out at his chair.
Oh, wow.
And there was some mothballed fleets right by us, and I looked over at the next one, was the Hornet.
Wow.
So that's a kind of coincidence.
Yeah.
Is there?
Yeah.
I was on that trip. That was pretty amazing.
So what was it like to, get back into San Francisco after being in India for so long?
Well, it was, I can remember coming in the bay there, and there was a train going along the bay there, and I thought, oh, good, American train again.
Oh.
But we went in for dinner or for lunch, whatever it was, and I remember taking a glass of milk, and it just tasted like I was drinking melted ice cream after that powdered milk for so long. It just, it just seemed so rich.
Wow. How long did it take you to get from India back to the States? Do you remember roughly?
Yeah, it was about a month.
Oh, jeez.
But I didn't mind it on the boat. I think the food was pretty good, and of course everybody's happy. They're going home.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I always heard everybody that came back that way, when they went under the Golden Gate Bridge, it was just so special.
Oh yes, I remember going under and the "Welcome Home" sign on the bridge, and I couldn't help but think of that. The way they treated the Vietnam vets when they came back, that was sorry. I felt so sorry for them, because that was a wicked war.
Yeah.
You never knew who your enemy was.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you had gone completely around the world then?
Yes, went kind of around the world.
Yeah.
That's right.
Wow.
So then you took a train up to Fort Lewis, right? And you took a train from San Francisco up to Fort Lewis?
Correct.
And that's where the other story about the gentleman that you thought had malaria.
Correct.
But
Yeah, we were in the Center Valley of California or someplace along in there.
But didn't
Woodinville or one of those places along there.
similar to when you were on the airplane, didn't the train conductor let you come up into the cabin there too?
No.
I'm mixing that up.
Oh no, you're right. I'd forgotten that. Coming up on the train, of course, there was steam engines in those days. And one of my buddies there had been a fireman for the Great Northern Railroad. And so when we had kind of a long stop someplace, he went up to the cab and asked if we could go up there. And so he came back and got us. We went up in the cab of the engine.
Oh, wow.
And of course, the veterans could do anything in those days.
Yeah.
And so we went quite a few miles, and we got to Oregon City, which is just outside of Portland. And he says, I can't go into Portland with you up here, I have to go back. But I had a nice ride in the steam engine.
Oh, wow, nice. Yeah. And then so up to Fort Lewis, that's where you mustered out then?
Right.
Yeah.
Up to Fort Lewis.
And then back home. I can't imagine what that reunion was like when you got home, particularly your mom, who was a worrywart. She had to be so relieved to have you back home, I would imagine.
Oh yes. Yes, indeed. I can remember, no, I guess this was on a furlough one time. I got furlough a couple of times when I was in Camp Walters. And you had to, I took the train to Portland, but I had to take the bus down to Roseburg. And I remember coming to Eugene, that's where the university is. And I had a little time, so I called a girl in sorority there just to say hello. And she says, "Oh boy, we're having some sort of big dance that night. Oh, why don't you come over and stay overnight and go to that dance?" And I'd been sitting up on the coach in the train for 4 days, and I just felt, I just didn't do that. Plus, I knew my folk were just danged, so I declined that and went on home.
Wow.
But I've always been impressed of my mother. After that one incident, she seemed as calm.
Oh,
I remember when the folks had to take the bus back up to Portland. I could tell my dad was about to weep, but Mom stood there as sturdy as an.
Wow.
I was really surprised at that.
Well, now you're home, and take your story now. You're home, and now take your story from there. How was that transition for you after all you'd been through in India? The transition back to civilian life again now.
Well, I was back to civilian life.
And civilized life.
Yeah. And, well, I had a few days off, and my dad thought I should go to work. Well, he knew a fellow in town. One of the big dairies was called the Umpqua Dairy, and there was kind of a partnership. He knew one of the partners there, and he went to him and asked him if he had a job that I could do. He says, "Oh yeah, I'll send him on down." So I went down there, and the job that was meant to be was in the creamery part, where you're in there mixing things and wearing rubber boots and all that. I didn't like that too much, but then he came in and wondered if he could change and have me work on the milk trucks, delivering milk out. Boy, I jumped at that. I'd much rather be outside. And so I did that, delivering milk, and I enjoyed that job too. And this was in the war now. Huh. And, or was this before? No, the war was over. Well, the incident's the same, I guess, because the war was still on. Maybe that was another time I was home. But anyway, I was working for this dairy. I'm a little mixed up in my time
That's
now.
okay.
And because of the war, I think it's kind of a publicity stunt, but also trying to help the war effort. They hired a man, and he took a chassis and built a wagon on top of it and got a team of horses. And he had a fellow take care of the horses. And so I delivered milk with the horses.
Really, yeah?
And we got a picture here of it. And that was really, I enjoyed that because it was kind of different. And the old folks come out and went and nuzzled the horses and everything. And the horses never gave me any trouble. And well, that was really fun. And I can remember that was hot time in the summertime. And in Roseburg, some of the streets of the east are pretty steep. And with this wagon, they made a mistake. They put on an automobile chassis, so that added a lot of weight to it. With rubber tires and everything, it added a lot of weight to it. And so on some of these steep hills, I had a helper with me. There was two of us on the wagon. So we would get out and help push the wagon up those poor horses, they'd be foaming and everything. So we get up the top, we stop under a tree and let them kind of cool off.
So you're back home now, and then I assume then did you return to college then, or?
And yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I like that milk job, but I thought, gee, I guess, see, my dad was a plasterer, and he had me working with him. I think he kind of had visions of being Bill and Son or something, working together. But there was a disadvantage in that I was so much taller than he was. So when we were working on like in the ceiling inside, why, he'd have to reach so much harder. And if you're working up like that, the closer you can get to your head, the easier it is. And so that made it hard on him. But I remember working stuccoing on the outside of a house. And I just decided, I don't think I want to do this the rest of my life. And I want to go back to college, so I did. And that's when I was in the vet storm, and I mentioned about the names there, didn't I?
Not
The fellow, the hall next to me was, I didn't mention that?
Oh.
Well, Oregon, when I went to school at first, had about 3,000 matriculating there. And when we came back, of course, with the GI Bill and everything, it doubled to about 6,000. So the university had to fix some housing, and they got some kind of prefab buildings, 5 of them there, right on Sorority Row. And so I moved one of those, and the one that I moved into was called Minturn. And I'd never heard that name before, never heard of it, never since, until I ran into the little town of Minturn here in western Colorado. But the next one was Paul. I thought of it just a minute ago, I can't think of his name now. But when I first went to college the first time, I stayed in this co-op thing. I think I mentioned that. Well, he was in that co-op, and he was killed during the war. So one of the names were halls were named after him.
So each of the buildings was named after a student that had been lost in the war.
What?
Each of the buildings had been named after a student of U of O that had been lost in the war.
He was lost. They all were named after people lost in the war.
Yeah.
But I didn't know him before. I just lost. His first name was Paul, but I can't think of his last name right now.
And so what did you end up getting your degree in then? What did you?
Well, that's a little story too. I mentioned I was in the pre-med courses.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe if I'm having so much trouble with this, I could never do very well as a meteorologist. I better think about something else. So I took an aptitude test. And the aptitude test came out, it said, insurance salesman.
Really? Yeah.
Well, I wasn't interested in insurance salesman, but I decided to go back to Oregon anyway, but switch my majors. So I ended up with a BS degree in business, and that turned to be okay. I did well in that. As a matter of fact, I didn't want to get involved with anybody particularly because I wanted to have the college experience and go through that, which I did.
Yeah.
And well, my last year at Oregon, they had one course in meteorology. It was called pilot's meteorology. It was meant for pilots to learn a little bit about, that was our textbook. But I said, I'll go do that anyway. And in class, I got to talking with the fellow, and he was a med aide at the airport station in Eugene. And he says, well, there's an opening now, civil service exam for meteorological aid. Why don't you just go ahead and take it? And I thought, well, what have I got to lose? I went ahead and took it. And you get the application from the post office, and I was asking for this, and the post office clerk was trying to be real. He says, no, what you should sign up for is Social Security Administration. And because, that was just growing. Well, I wasn't interested in paperwork as such. That didn't interest me at all. So I stayed with the med exam. I took that. And, after, I think I'm kind of getting mixed up at the time, but after graduating from Oregon, I got a job in the men's clothing store. And so I was working there, and I didn't particularly like that either. I didn't like salesmanship, what you're supposed to do. If somebody comes in and wants something, I'm glad to help. I don't like selling things to people. So, but I was working in this, it was one of the nicer men's wear stores in Roseburg. And it was a pretty good salary, actually. And Kay and I were married.
Well, you need to back up and tell that story. You need to back up and tell how you met Kay and how you wooed her and everything.
Okay, that's a good story too. I was living in these Merrick. Paul Merrick is the name of the fellow that was. I was. They had to cram us into these dorms, and our little group of 5 had 2 rooms. So what we did is put all our bunks in one room and all our study desks in the other room. And we got pretty well acquainted, of course. And a friend of mine, he was from my home area, although I didn't know him really well at that time. I knew him, but not really well. He was going with a girl in the sorority across the street. And he came to me one day and says, say, how would you like to double date? I'll get one of Kay's sisters to go, or get Charlotte, I think her name was, to go, and we'll go out together. And I thought, well, what have I got to lose? I'll do this. So we did, and I met Kay, and we went to kind of a roadside tavern in Springfield, which is about 5 miles south of Eugene. And they had a little dance floor in this tavern and a little band, live music there. Well, I didn't mention that the latter years in high school and through college, I played in different dance bands in nightclubs and things like that.
Wow.
And so we went there and they had this little band. I identified with it right away because that's the kind of thing I've been playing with. And so we started, we were dancing there and had a couple of drinks. And I remember and Kay told me about this later. And then when we were dancing, you have your arm around, and the song was one I knew, and I was kind of playing on the piano on her back. And she came back and she thought, what type of a goon did I get this time? So that's how I met Kay. And gee, well, I don't know. Can you anything else?
Well, but now you jumped back to how you met Mom, but now you need to jump forward to how you got into the Weather Service.
Oh, yeah, I didn't mention that. Yes. Kay and I were married, and we went on the fancy train down to San Francisco for our honeymoon. And we were staying in San Francisco, just kind of sightseeing there. And a telegram, it came in to Kay's mother, offering me a job in the weather service.
Really? Wow.
And
But you need to back up a little bit more.
You need to finish the story about taking that exam. So you couldn't get the telegram until you got the results from the exam, right?
no, the telegram was results of the exam.
Oh, okay.
He said, I took the exam, and so I guess I was put on the register or something. When they had an opening, why, they would take the first name on the list, I think. Well, there was an opening, and it was for, a little bit before that, right, before we were married. Before we were married, I got an offer. Yeah, that was at home. And they had a position at Meacham, Oregon. It's up in the Blue Mountains in northeastern Oregon. But it was an isolated station, and they just wanted men there, and they stayed there. And so I had to write back to the Weather Service and say, I'm planning to be married shortly. I don't think I could handle that. So that was fine. And so then later, when we were on our honeymoon, we got the second telegram offering me a job in Burns, Oregon. I don't know if you know Oregon very well.
A little bit.
But it's out in the middle of the western desert.
Oh, okay.
And it's a little cow town of about 3,500 people at that time. But, and it paid less than what I was making in the store. But I thought it'd be nice if Kay had kind of went off by herself with no family influence, and this gave an opportunity to do that. So I took that job, and we went to Burns, Oregon, and I really liked it there too. It was sort of like Greeley over here, all wearing Western garb, and I can remember in the fall, in September, they had a Harney County Fair, a big parade, and the outside Indians would come in on all their things and go. A priest came down in his cowboy boots and was riding in the parade. You know, it's that sort of thing. And of course, I worked kind of scattered shifts that time. And in fact, they were split. They were not too much. In the daytime and the nighttime, they were split. So I had worked the nights, and I walked downtown for something. We were living right close to town. Walked downtown for something. Gee, there was something going on. There was a parade there and everything. And I asked somebody, oh, what's going on here? Well, we're celebrating United Nations Day. Just to show, in a small town, it was 132 miles to Bend, which is a much larger town, and it was 132 miles to Ontario on the other side. So it was really out there by itself, but I really liked that.
Wow.
But then...
How long were you guys out there before?
Well, we were in Burns that long, and I got an estimate to go to the regional office with my business background, I guess. So I went to, I didn't much want to do this, but I thought career-wise I should do this. So that was in Salt Lake City. So we moved to Salt Lake City, and I worked there. And that was okay. Salt Lake City at that time was not too bad. The Mormons came around once, and I just said, well, we already have our religion. They say, okay. I never heard from them again. And they're really nice people. I really was impressed with them. I liked it there. I know there's an older man lived just across the street, and I'd go over and visit with him sometimes on his front porch, and he'd tell me stories about the local, really nice person. Well, Kay kind of got involved and to take his wife to go get groceries. And so he would take him to get groceries and come back. And pretty soon, they had a daughter that lived not too far away. We turned out she didn't like that too much, thought we were trying to butt in there. And so we quit doing that.
Oh, wow. And then from Salt Lake, where'd you go?
From Salt Lake City, then I had an offer to go to Washington.
D.C.? Or
D.C.
state? Wow.
Right. And,
Dad, what about Montana?
oh, that's right. Yeah, that was from Montana. Yeah, I'm sorry. From Burns, I off. Well, so having the job in Salt Lake City was a clerk in the personnel office, and they had work stacked up there, and that's what faced faith when I went in there. And finally, I worked myself out of a job. And so the personnel office was trying to work out something for me, and there was an opening coming in Kalispell, Montana.
Oh, wow.
And so he arranged for me to go out to the airport in Salt Lake City and work with those fellas for a while to kind of refresh myself as to what was going on. So I did that at Salt Lake City Airport for a week or 10 days or something like that. And then we liked Salt Lake City all right. And one thing that I remember, our office was just off of Temple Square. And to get there, I had to walk. I always walked to work at that time. It's probably a mile or better, but I didn't have a car. And so I had to walk through a bunch of taverns and saloons or walk by them
Really?
to get to our office. And I couldn't help thinking to myself, would Brigham Young turn over in his grave if he saw this?
Yeah.
And
What about the blizzard?
What about the blizzard?
oh, yeah, and
In Montana.
Well, we're still in
well,
Salt Lake.
the station in Kalispell was kind of the north end of the valley, the Flathead Valley. Then farther to the south is the large Flathead Lakes. That's probably my hearing aid. And but what happens there when these cold fronts come down east of the mountains, like Cut Bank and so on, it gets extremely cold. Well, we're more in the Pacific atmosphere here. It might be 30 or 40, but no big heavy blizzards. But if that cold air mass coming down gets thick enough, then it flows through passes over the mountains on where we are. And the airport was situated right in the path of that. You know, it's coming through that. It's like a Venturi effect. It gets stronger as it comes through there. And our office were right in the middle of that strong stream. And the people of Kalispell, several miles south, didn't even know any winds were going on. But we would, and I have some, in fact, my friend there sent me some copies of the weather records I made on one of these blizzard things. And I think it was one of the worst they'd ever had. It seems to me we were 25 or 30 degrees below zero and the wind going about 70 miles an hour. It was really pretty cold.
Wow.
And it came up while I was, my days off were Wednesday and Thursday. And it turns out I started on one of those days off. And so I was home. But, when we moved there, housing was kind of scarce. And we never had bought because I didn't want to be tied down. I wanted to be free to move with this career indicated.
Now, did you have family at that point, or was it still just the two of you?
Just the two of us, right, that time. So we, that's just a kind of little side story. We lived in a motel there for about the month or 6 weeks that we moved there, and we had a mother cat and a couple of kittens, keeping in that motel room. Well, after we'd be in there for a while, we could let her out and she would come back to the door. Well, one time we let her out and she came back, but she missed the door and she had a mouse. And she went to the lady next door, scared the lady. She got up on the chairs. Really scared her. But eventually we got heard about a fellow that had kind of a farm out by the airport. I thought, well, gee, that'd be just fine. I could just walk to work. So I talked to him, and yes, we agreed on that. And it was 80 acres, and he raised wheat on most of it. And I had him save me a little garden spot so I could draw a garden there. And so that's where we lived for a while. And then one of these storms came up, the one I'm mentioning, and I was still home, and the roads were drifting full, and we were off the road a little bit, and to get power, we had a pole right in our yard. The wind blew over that pole, and fortunately, it didn't break off the power. And I learned something from that because I called the power company, and they come up with one of these power wagons or something comparable to that. And I learned that when cars, this is in the early 50s, when the cars sometimes get stalled, it's the snow gets under the hood and kills the engine. It's not also just a power failure or snow's too deep. And but he made it there, and he just I had a sawbuck there near sawwood in, and he just put it there and put the pole on that, and I still had power, and then they'd come back later in better weather to fix it. So my partner was stuck at the office there because I couldn't get out. The road in the low spot had drifted full. So finally he said, well, things are kind of coming down there. Could I come and relieve him? I said, sure, I'll do. Oh yeah, one other thing. During this time, across the street, the fellow had a few cows, cattle, not milk cows, just other cows. And he worked for the railroad up in Whitefish, which is about 10 or 15 miles away. And he called me with the storm. He says, could I go over to his place and get the cows in the barn? So I said, yeah, I would do that. So I went over there, and I got the cows in the barn, all right. And then I had to go for quite a dip to get to the barn. And I got inside his house, and his breakfast dishes were still in the sink, and a drift was across their kitchen. It drifted under the door, and it drifted over the dishes in the sink. And his heat was a 55-gallon oil drum hollowed out, and you built the fire in that. So I had to keep that fire going, and I drained his hot water heater so if it got below, it wouldn't freeze that up. But I got to looking out to the barn, and the cows were still out. Oh no, he had a light out there, and I left the light on. No, I left the light off. I'll get this right. Left the light off, but I was doing the work in the house. I looked out, and the light was back on. So I thought, well, I must have not turned that off. So I go back out and turn off the light, climb across that drift again, back in the house, and a short time later I looked out, the light was on. And this time I just left it on, and I was telling, Charlie Hulse was it, or not Hulse, Hull was his name, and I mentioned that, oh, that's old Bessie, she likes to go over there and rub against it. So, but to relieve my partner at the Weather Service, he had a pair of snowshoes there, and he says, "Why don't I use those snowshoes?" Well, I'd never been on snowshoes, but I says, "Okay, I'll give it a try." So it wasn't snowing so hard then; it was just real windy, and so Cave picked me up with. I had a backpack. We put some blankets and clothes and a little bit of extra food and that. And I was all loaded up and put on the horseshoes, and I horseshoed over at the Weather Service. And got a letter of commendation later from the chief of the bureau for dedication to the work.
Oh, wow.
And he got one too, because he was stuck there for 2 days without any food. He said he had a candy bar, and that was about all. Another thing that happened at that airport, it's nothing to do with me, except I was there. This is a small town, but there was an air transport there and a big hangar, and they would do charter flights for people and that sort of thing. And they had a young fellow there who thought he was pretty smart. And one Sunday I was on duty, and he took a friend up flying in a small plane, I don't remember what kind, but they were flying around, and he decided to buzz the office, and he came in and he buzzed this way, and I could see the underside of the airplane right by the building, and he went off. Later in the day, he crashed, and his passenger was killed.
Really? Wow.
And he was pretty badly injured, too. But just think about that. You know, he wasn't more than 50 feet away from the building. He could have crashed into that building, too, very well.
Yeah.
But fortunately, he didn't. And
So from Montana, then you got transferred to D.C.?
To D.C.
Wow, what a change there.
Oh, well, that was... well, I really didn't want to do that.
No.
But I thought, because it was a nice promotion to go there, so I went, and the job that I was recruited for is administrative officer to the director of research in the Weather Service. And so at that time, the Weather Service was pretty sparse, and our offices were in an old Spanish embassy building, and it wasn't the nicest at all, but that's all we had. But my desk was just outside of the Weather Bureau research chief. So being there, I had a chance to meet a lot of the big people in the Weather Service, because they'd come in to see the director there. Like, I know the fellow Fujiyama that invented this numbering system for tornadoes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And Bob Simpson, in his, he had a partner that I didn't know, developed the numbering system for hurricanes. This is an example of the kind of thing. It's very interesting. And, I was involved also, not directly, but kind of in the financing with development of the computers for weather forecasting.
Wow.
It's called the JNWP, Joint Numerical Weather Program. And it was jointly funded by the Weather Service, the Air Force, and the Navy. So we had 3 funds there to kind of keep track of. And their administrative officer, early on, we had kind of a get-go together. And I told him what I thought. And I remember Wexler, he was the director's wife, or not his wife, but his secretary, looking over at me. But that was one of the best things I did. We were best of friends after that. We both understood each other, and we worked together very well. But I can remember, it was out at Suitland, which is a suburb on the Maryland side. And I remember the first one, I think it was an IBM 750 or something like that. Wow. It went there in a whole, probably a room as big as this and
Yeah,
half more, all full of these computers, had to have special flooring on it with air conditioning under the floor. But that was still experimental. They
Right.
weren't using that.
Wow.
Kind of an interesting side strap. After we moved to Boulder, why the people across the street were Japanese, and they were about the same age as our kids were, and they played together quite a bit. And then we moved, and then shortly after that, they moved kind of right where we were behind, and we got pretty well acquainted. And they were nice folks, and he was a meteorologist up at NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research. And one time, Kay kind of had a garden party down on our back patio and had the Cosahares down. That was the Japanese people and a couple of other neighbors. And they came down, and it turned out that he was being assigned to Suitland to work with us and study this computer. And I said, oh, well, gee, that's really nice. I told him my experience with it. And he says, well, he has to go over there. You know, we have to keep ahead of the Japanese. And I didn't know how to respond to that, really. But when Yuko was his wife's name, and when Kay would be on the phone with Yuko, I could tell it right away because she kind of started talking this broken English, just like they do. And one of their daughters was Margaret, and Annie can tell you about Margaret.
Oh, well,
She lives down in Colorado Springs now, and they get together occasionally.
yeah.
And it's kind of nice, but I think Akra is not, well, he's on a walker just like I am, I guess. And,
So
well, I could tell you about Boulder, too.
yeah, so from Washington, then you were transferred to Boulder.
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
How long were you in D.C. roughly?
11 years, I think.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to go there. I did it just because
Yeah.
I thought it was the thing to
Right.
do. But I enjoyed my time there. It was exciting. There was always something going on. I can remember after the incident I remember the most is you remember when Gorbachev from Russia spoke before the joint congressional, and he took off his shoe and pounded on said, "We will bury you." Well, after that incident, they were coming back to the White House, and there was kind of a little parade there, and I had Kay come down too, and we were in that park I'm sorry, I can't think of the name, park just across from the White House, and Eisenhower and Gorbachev came by in their limousine. Eisenhower was stone-faced. And as the car went by, there was thousands of people there screaming. As they went by, there wasn't a sound. Not a cheering, not anything.
Wow,
It was
wow.
completely silent. And that always impressed me.
Wow. Wow.
You saw a couple of inaugurations
Yes,
and had a couple kids.
right.
You saw Kennedy's funeral. You saw some inaugurations. You had a couple kids, and you saw Kennedy's funeral.
Yes. Well, yeah, well, I think we were there for Eisenhower's second inauguration, the parade, and I think I got pictures of that. But I especially remember Kennedy's inauguration. The day before, we had a tremendous snowstorm, 8 or 12 or 14 inches, something like that. In fact, I was working downtown, and it was so bad they told we should quit and go home. And I was right downtown, and so I quit, and I had been commuting by bus, so I didn't have a car there. And by the time the bus got to my place, they were all jammed, you know, people leaving, and I think I was there for an hour or better before I could get a bus, and I thought, if I'd had better shoes on, I could have got home faster than on that bus. But some friends of ours, and he was in the weather service also, had been up in New England, and they were driving back, and they called Kay from Baltimore just before going under the tunnel there in Baltimore, and they were going to come and stay overnight with us. And I was just in Washington, which was 6 miles to my home. They got home long before I did.
Wow.
And but I guess the most impressive inauguration was Kennedy, and I got a picture of this, all it's kind of long distance, where he made his inaugural address, and he says, do what you will do for the country and not do for yourself. I don't have that quite right, but
that's not what you.
And I thought, boy, I'm hearing something, history words right there.
Wow, wow.
Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country.
Yeah.
That was, boy, we need somebody to say that right now too. And
and during this time, the girls were born. During this.
There's a brother too.
Brother, your children were born in D.C.
yes.
Yeah.
Two
Yes.
of them. All of them. So we have an
Oh
older
no,
brother.
Linda was born in Boulder.
Oh, okay.
But Anna David were born in D.C. at the well, I took some nighttime courses at George Washington University to prepare to take the other courses. So I got the equivalent of a degree in meteorology before I got through. But where they took Kennedy when they took him to Washington, the University Hospital, and that's where Bill and Ann both were born.
Oh, wow.
And I can remember when Bill was born, the University Hospital's right, you know, they have these circles. They call them, they don't call them, we call them circles. And
Roundabouts.
well, yeah, it could be that. But there was one of those right outside the hospital. And I can remember just before Bill was born, we have a bassinet that's been handed down. You know, Bill and her brother were raised in that little bassinet, and we were kind of fixing it up and getting it ready in the afternoon. And Kay got her call that evening to go to the hospital, and it was in September. And I can remember, you know, they stayed in the hospital a little longer, though, than they do now.
Yeah.
But I remember taking Kay to the window, and we could look out on this called Washington Circle, and the trees were just starting to turn, and it was really beautiful. I just always remember that kind of scene.
And so then from Washington, you transferred to Boulder.
Yes.
And is that where you finished out your career then in Boulder?
And then started, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, go through a couple of iterations. It was the Weather Bureau, and then there was a consolidation. It's called Environmental Science Service Administration. And they combined with that the old Coast and Geodetic Survey and a lab from the National Bureau of Standards. And seems to me there was another organization, but it doesn't really matter, to form ESSA. So since I was familiar with the Washington area, I was called back to Washington on temporary duty to help with all the paperwork in this consolidation. And we rented kind of an apartment there and stayed there pretty much the summer, I think. And then it wasn't too long after that, we had another consolidation, and that's when NOAA, NOAA, was formed. And that brought in part of the National Science Foundation and part of the NBS and the kind of, they have a fisheries thing now. The fisheries was brought into it because it has to do with the oceans. And the theory, I think, behind NOAA was to get closer to and study the interaction between the oceans and the atmosphere and the land. And so try to get these people all together to work on that. And so I would, well, let's see, was Linda Boardman then? Did you go back when we stayed? That was before your time? Well, the rest of us went back and stayed.
I didn't go to DC until I was 2.
Okay. Well, let's see, what was I going to say about that? Well, I guess the only when I went back the second time, my temporary office was just kind of in the office of the Secretary of Commerce, just that had space there, and he had an administrative officer in the next room from mine, and I was working on the NOAA things, but I had quite a bit of interaction with him. And he was just swamped. He just had loads of paper, and when I could, I tried to help him out a little bit. And on the NOAA one, he offered me a job to come back there to work. Didn't help him. We got along really well. I've been working right in the office of secretary, but I didn't. I just didn't want to go back there again. And my folks were getting older, and mine were in Oregon, and Kay's were in Washington, and I wanted to get closer. And so that's one reason I was so happy to come to Boulder, because I'd be closer to them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So how many years altogether was your career then with the government?
Career?
Yeah, how many years?
About 35 years, I think. But service time counted, too, for that.
Wow.
Is there anything else I've forgotten?
The only thing I happen to remember was, I think when you were with Peter Vidmar in Texas, you saw the train come back with some Merrill's Marauders on it, and you had a comment.
Oh,
about
well, that wasn't. That was still in India.
Oh, was
yes,
it? Okay.
I'd mentioned, that I wanted to go to China-Burma-India theater.
Yeah.
As we were going in, we met some fellows coming out, and they had been with Merrill's Marauders, and they were sad. They were dissipated. I mean, we could talk to them and everything, but their clothes were down. They really had a rough time.
Yeah. Wow.
It's kind of an interesting connection in a way. There was a girl in Roseburg that I really took a liking to. And she was a couple of years older than I was. In fact, I'd been kind of eyeing her since 7th grade. And I always thought, well, when I get married, that looks like the girl I'd like to marry. And but she had a younger sister, and but she was about a year younger than me. But so I finally got the guts, and I asked her for a date. And she said, no, she couldn't do that. So I was turned down. Well, I didn't know at that time, but she turned me down because she was engaged to the bigger brother of a girl I knew very well in high school. And they were married, and he went to CBI. He was one of, well, they were called the Flying Tigers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I can't think of his name. Chenault.
Yeah.
Chenault's Flying Tiger.
Uh-huh.
He was he was flying with them, and his plane was shot down. And just in the last 4 or 5 years, I saw an article in the paper. They found his plane in Cambodia.
Wow.
Isn't that something?
Wow.
That's wild.
Yeah. Well, talk a little bit about family now. You got the 3 children. How many years were you and Kay married? How many years were you and Kay married?
Oh, we were married 66 years. We were married in 1950. And Kay says, we'll get married in this year. We won't have any trouble figuring out when our
And 3 children?
3 children.
Grandchildren, great-grandchildren?
I have 3 grandchildren as well. One of them I might mention, it's Linda's oldest daughter, her oldest child, was named Queen of the Weld County Fair for next year.
Oh, wow. Oh, excellent.
And she's a very good student, and a lot of activities. And her younger brother, Alex, is very scientifically oriented. He's invited to go to the Colorado World's Fair in Pueblo because he's been making these rockets. And he's going to demonstrate his rocket down there. Maybe Linda can tell me more about that.
They have a fly day, so they go down. He qualified through the Weld County Fair to go to the state fair to fly.
Excellent.
So.
And then your 3rd grandchild. What? Tell a little bit about.
Well, that 3rd one is Bill's daughter, and she graduated from CSU, and I think she's kind of undecided what her future's going to be yet.
She's working on a farm right now.
Yeah, she's working on a farm. I don't know.
She's really into natural resources and environmental preservation.
Okay.
And
Yeah, she's been working. Oh yeah, another interesting thing. She likes forestry and that sort of thing. So she worked for the Forest Service in the summertime, but then she got invited to go to Africa.
Wow.
To work with a group, I guess it's a church group, is working with the, around in Kenya area. They worked there, she was there for a couple of weeks, and doing that.
The other interesting thing is his father was a fire lookout in Oregon and in the Forest Service, so it's just
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
a forestry.
Yeah, my dad,
connection
when he
there.
was a kid, he was in Oregon, Southern Oregon, and they were just starting these lookouts on the mountaintops to watch for forest fires. And they'd have a transit there that they could zero in on it. And also, I haven't told this because I had forgotten, but when we were talking about India and the horses, they used, I was thinking that the main reason was to ship them over to China, but the Merrill Marauders and Stillwells, they needed pack horses and things for those too. Well, my dad used to pack horses for the Forest Service. I'd forgotten about that.
Be darned. Wow.
And he was really good with knots, a half inch and a full inch. He tried to teach it to me, but it just didn't stay with me. That just wasn't for me.
Yeah, it's all interesting how it's intertwined with your dad and the grandchildren, what they've got involved with, and they're kind of similar to what your career, I mean, in the sciences, and everybody's kind of connected. I
Yes,
guess.
we have
A
been.
lot of connections and coincidences
Yeah.
in
Yes,
Yeah.
just a lot.
Yeah.
This doesn't involve us, but I was just reading an article. Oh, well, one other thing I mentioned. From our little group of 7 enlisted personnel, when the later road was open, then it was open all the way to Kunming, China. And they asked for volunteers to drive the first convoy that
Yeah, you
went
told me
through.
that one. Yeah.
And one of our fellows,
Yeah.
I guess I did
Yeah,
tell you that. Well, I was just reading in one of my magazines that a fellow that went on that more as a document or a courtier to explain it. And he says that he was at one of the ordnance depots. You know, that was hard on the trucks. They had a hard time. It's big steep hills and downhills and everything. They had a lot of maintenance. And he, as one of these maintenance stops, and he was there at his truck, and a couple came up on a Jeep, and they were sitting on the fenders of the Jeep, and they come up to this fellow and says, "Are you Mr. Frost?" "Yes, I'm Mr. Frost." "Well, I'm your cousin from Bremerton, Washington."
Wow.
Isn't that a coincidence?
Yeah. Well, speaking of your unit, after the war and through the years, did you keep in touch with anybody? Was there any sort of reunions or anything like that?
Well, not really. The fellow Pete, who was a close friend, when we were driving to Washington, when we were transferred there, he lived in Joliet. And so when we went through there, I called him and said, just drop in and say hello.
Yeah.
Well, gee, they had a big celebration. He brought out his best wine, and we had kind of a little time there. And then one of the fellows in our tent was Provo, Utah. And he came up, when we lived in Salt Lake City, he came up for a visit one time. And then the captain, who was the dentist, well, they were very nice. I remember when the GI Bill was passed, he kind of took me aside and says, "Nate, with that GI Bill, you pick out what you want to do and pick the best school for that and make the most of it." I thought that was good advice.
Yeah.
And then when we were married, I think we sent them an announcement, and they gave us a little silver cup, which I thought was nice.
Wow.
And I think that's the only contact I've had with them since then.
Well, as we start to wind down this interview,
Okay.
is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about? Any of the stories that have kind of floated to the top? And I'd open up to you guys too if there's anything we left out, so that ideally we rounded out your story as best we can. Or do you think we got everything you wanted to talk about?
I think we covered everything that we've done in the pre part. I can't think of anything else right
No,
now.
I think that's covered pretty well.
Well, the last question I always like to ask in this interview,
Okay.
as you look back on your time in the service, particularly your time in India, as you look back on it, did it change your life, affect your life, play a role in your life, or was it just simply a chapter in your life? How would you answer that?
I'd say I think it affected my life.
Yeah.
Not that I hated the military. I thought the military, there's discipline there, but we need some discipline too. And it wasn't overdone.
Yeah.
Well, one other kind of coincidence, I think I mentioned MASH. Are you familiar with that?
Oh yeah.
TV?
Oh yeah.
Well, the tent that they were living in looked just exactly
Is that
like
right?
we
Yeah.
had our tent.
Yeah.
It's just, and of course they treated the local people. We treated the local people like that too, and now I've forgotten what I really started out to say.
Major Burns?
Oh yes, and it turns out our squadron, the commanding officer was Major Burns.
Is that right?
So isn't that a connection?
Another coincidence.
But he wasn't like the Major Burns.
Right.
He was all business, but not offensively so.
Yeah.
I mean, he was approachable and everything, but no fooling around with him.
Yeah, I'll be darned. Well, Nate, I want to thank you for sitting down today to tell your story, but just as important, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you very much.